So very briefly, and I won't get into the details, KBAs are sites that contribute significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. So it's important to make sure that everyone understands this definition, because there are many definitions of areas that are important for biodiversity. There are many criteria by which you might decide whether an area is important for biodiversity, but the key biodiversity area standard is one tool that is consistent and used globally now to identify areas that are disproportionately important to making sure that species and ecosystems persist into the future. So we'll talk a little bit about the criteria in a second, but it's something very specific. It's not a general idea of identifying places of importance for biodiversity. There are several criteria, and I think Robin might get into these in more detail, but just to say that key biodiversity areas are not about only species at risk or species even, but they're actually able to capture species at risk, threatened species, but also threatened ecosystems, geographically restricted species and ecosystems. So that means species and ecosystems that are quite rare and are only found in small parts of the landscape, so that it's really important to make sure that these are stewarded in some way. It also captures, large aggregations of species and areas that are really high in ecological integrity. But I'll let Robin get into those details a little bit further. We have two different standards in order to identify key biodiversity areas, and these standards exist at the global scale. So there's the global standard published by a global partnership led by IUCN, but also contributed to by scientists from Canada. And that standard was only published in 2016. So this is a relatively new tool that was asked for by the global conservation community, so that there might be one tool that could, in a uniform and consistent way, be able to identify these sites. So it's very much a site-scaled approach to conservation that are important for all species and all ecosystems. In the last 2 years, we started working in Canada, and we're one of the first countries, in fact, to have a national effort to try to identify all key biodiversity areas. And in the past 2 years, we also developed a national adaptation of the global standard. And that was because we wanted to make sure that we would capture biodiversity elements that are priorities in Canada. So, for example, the global standard, which we still use in conjunction with the national standard, is able to capture only full species. So you can identify a site for a threatened species or a rare or endemic species, but not subspecies or populations. The national standard does allow us to look at infraspecies. So, for example, caribou populations, as opposed to looking at all caribou across the world, including reindeer. So it's a little bit more specific to Canada. It allows us to make sure that we can include Canadian conservation priorities as well, but in the same consistent, rigorous and quantitative way. So a tool for conservation, it's an information layer. This is really important to mention. There's no management prescription. It's not about putting a protected area around every key biodiversity area, although some people or some organizations might want to lobby for that. But there's no impact on access to land by just identifying a key biodiversity area. It's really a tool to figure out where these places are that we need to pay attention to, that we need to ensure are stewarded in some way. So I already mentioned, it's not another single species approach. It's a broad biodiversity approach that includes all taxa and ecosystems. It's not a negotiated process. You can't sort of veto a key biodiversity area. If you have the data that shows that the quantitative thresholds have been met, so a certain percentage of a species is found on a particular site, then it is a KBA. As long as the evidence is there, and there's a lot of work that has to go into that, a lot of evidence presented, all forms of knowledge can go into providing that evidence. So it's a scientific analytical tool and not a process that can be discussed, although there's lots of room for collaboration and input to be given on this. And so the process involves identifying biodiversity elements that might qualify, figuring out if there's sufficient data to identify a site that holds the required proportion of a species population or of an ecosystem extent, and then drawing a boundary around that biodiversity element in a way that makes sense, that you end up with a site. And a last thing is that you can have a site, any size is appropriate, but it should still be considered a site, and that is open to interpretation to some degree. But there are lots of guidelines and ideas about what actually constitutes a site. So I won't get into that, but there's the guidelines that come along with the KBA standard are very thick with a lot of details about data standards, delineation, all sorts of approaches. So at the national scale, this is what KBA Canada looks like. On the left, actually, it's the global scale, and we mirror the global KBA partnership a little bit. But on the right side, you have the Canadian Key Biodiversity Area Coalition, and this is really an open group. It's open to anyone who's interested in supporting or participating in the work of identifying key biodiversity areas, or even making use of the results as well. And so we have a number of NGOs that were a key in starting up this work. But then also there's some umbrella groups for governments. So the Pathway to Canada Target 1 National Steering Committee is part of this work, and that incorporates most provincial territorial governments, Indigenous government, as well as some municipal governments as well. And so a subset of that is there's a management committee where we have representation from about 6 or 7 of those groups. There's a KBA secretariat, and actually it's a bit of a distributed secretariat. We consider WCS Canada, Birds Canada, and NatureServe Canada to form that secretariat, as we are the organizations that are organizing, coordinating different aspects of this work.
Hi, Kira. Sorry to interrupt you. It looks like we're having some trouble with people seeing your slides changing.
Oh, okay.
I'm able to see it on my screen, but it looks like in the chat we have a few people. Would you maybe be able to unshare and then reshare your screen?
I can try. I'm not sure that will make a difference, but we will try.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. What's this? Okay. Let's see if this works. Do you see the governance slide?
I'm seeing the KBA
Yes.
Canada main structures.
Okay. I'm very happy to share this slide presentation afterwards as well.
Okay.
So in case anyone has missed any of the details and you want to go over them.
Perfect. Thanks, Kira.
Move on to the next slide, which is progress to date. I'm going to go through it right away so that there's a greater chance that people will see the actual content. But just to say that, we're 2 years in, we've developed quite a lot of infrastructure. There's the different governance structures. There's a website, and we have an internal KBA Canada wiki as well to provide sort of the tools and guidance for people trying to do the work of identifying KBAs. We have this national KBA standard, which has been accepted by provincial and territorial governments. We have several databases where we're working with sort of NatureServe Canada on one to do millions of species records that we have developed in collaboration with all the provincial and territorial conservation data centers. There is NatureServe Canada is developing range maps for all of the species that we're looking at, which is going to be, all of this will be available freely and openly to everyone, including habitat suitability models. So there's a lot of ancillary sort of great data that's being produced as well. We have regional coordinators in a lot of places. We're just starting up in Ontario. We're so thrilled to be doing that. It took a while. Well, we work in a sort of modular fashion. As we secure funding in one province or territory, we hire someone there so that that the work can be based in that place with experts from that place who know much better the conservation context, the species, the landscapes than we do in the central office. So we're pleased to have secured funding for Ontario. The Greenbelt Foundation was key to us being able to hire Robin and get going here. So we've identified 240 new KBAs across the country to date. There's also these legacy IBAs that are being reassessed, and I'm not going to talk about them because actually I'll show a map just to show you how important they are, but then Amanda Beekle will be talking to you about those because they're such a foundational element of KBAs in Ontario. We're doing a lot of continued outreach, partnership building, Indigenous engagement at local, regional, and national scales. We have a real focus on the provinces and territories because of our relationship with those governments through the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process. We have monthly newsletters and webinars, so there will be lots of opportunities to learn more about the KBA project. And if you're interested, make sure you contact Robin and we can make sure that you're on the lists. I won't stop here for too long, just to say this is where we're working so far. In some regions we have almost completed the work, for example, in Yukon and Atlantic Canada. In some places we're just getting started. We're about halfway through in BC, we're just getting started in the prairies, and we're just getting started in Ontario as well. So this was the map that I wanted to show you, but Amanda will have probably a better map, just to say that, you know, we have IBAs spread across Canada. Even at the global scale, most key biodiversity areas right now that exist are legacy important bird areas, because those were already identified in a quantitative, standardized way over the past several decades. And so we're now adding taxa to those. Birds Canada is reassessing them, and I won't say any more, just to say that this is a great start across the country. And this is what the new KBAs look like across the country too. These have been identified regionally and scoped out also using available data to us. So you'll see that there are some gaps there. So Ontario and Quebec need to be filled in, and some of the prairie areas as well. I'm going to leave it at that so that you can get into the more topical part focused on Ontario, but definitely visit our website for more information, and we have lots of different sort of products and webinars that you can see online to learn about all different aspects of this work. I just want to end by saying thank you to our donors, in particular the Greenbelt Foundation, but also other donors that have been very important. Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Pathway process, and then to all the organizations involved in this work over the past 2 years as well. So I will hand it back to Robin now.
Thanks so much, Kira. That was great. Yeah, we just had some comments in the chat, so we'll just make sure that Kira sends out the PowerPoint. So if you did miss some slides or it was too small to see, we'll send it out after the fact, so hopefully you can catch up then. So thanks again, Kira. Next, I'd like to introduce Amanda Beekle, who is the Ontario Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas Coordinator with Birds Canada. And Amanda is going to discuss the transition from important bird and biodiversity areas to KBAs within Ontario. Thank you, Amanda.
Yep. Hi, thanks for the introduction. I'll just, hopefully this will work. And you'll see my screen changing, hopefully. Can you see the presentation now?
I can see your desktop right now. Yeah, now I can see it.
Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Kira, to KBAs. I'm going to talk about kind of part of that KBA puzzle, which is the assessment that we did on IBAs and which IBAs will qualify as KBAs going forward, and we call that the crosswalk. First, I'll just give a little introduction to Birds Canada. We're a non-for-profit, non-governmental charity, and our mission is to conserve wild birds through sound science, on-the-ground actions, innovative partnerships, and public engagement. So basically, we do everything we can with the help of a diverse and really passionate set of members and volunteers to conserve wild birds and their habitat. What started out as Long Point Bird Observatory in 1960 is now the oldest bird observatory in the Western Hemisphere. And we banded our millionth bird in 2017, so it's kind of exciting. In the 90s, we became Bird Studies Canada. And then in a few years ago, a year ago now, we became Birds Canada to better highlight the outreach and engagement and education work that we do. And right now we have around 50 to 75 staff members, depending on the season. And we run 40 citizen science programs, including Christmas bird count, feeder watch, species at risk projects, and birding atlases, which is big right now in Ontario. And through those and more programs, we engage over 50,000 people across Canada. A little bit about the IBA program. So more broadly, it is a program that aims to identify, monitor, and conserve a network of sites that provide essential habitat for wild birds. And IBAs are a suite of designated sites, which are part of a huge global program. I believe there's around 12,000 sites globally right now in almost every country. And similar to KBAs, IBAs are non-governmental, non-regulatory, meaning they're not recognized as protected lands by law in Canada. And they have a huge size range from small patches of habitat to large tracts of land or water. And they can be on any type of land, including urban, rural, public, and private. And then they also sometimes overlap with parks, wildlife management areas, and other formal means of protection. Although only about half of our IBAs have some protection. I'll also say that we have IBA coordinators across Canada. So I am the Ontario coordinator, and we have someone in each province kind of looking after that. They're not all with Birds Canada. Some are with like Nature Alberta and Nature Manitoba, but there's someone designated in each province. And we also have caretakers and volunteers, which we try to get out to IBAs. There are local on-the-ground experts and stewards, and we really couldn't do much without them. So it's great to have them with the program. So what are we doing in regards to KBAs? Last year we made this story map. If you haven't seen it, check it out. There's the link to view it. We are working on the database kind of in the background with WCS and NatureServe to kind of put all our databases together. And with that data, we are developing tools to put on a website, and they will be accessible to the public. And they're really cool tools to explore maps, species data, polygons, and all the sites, all the KBA sites that will be on there. And then Birds Canada is doing the crosswalk, which is what I will talk about for the rest of the presentation. So again, the crosswalk was an analysis that we did to determine which IBAs in Canada will be candidate KBAs. And why did we do this crosswalk? Well, like Kira said, the IBA program has been around for more than 20 years, and there are many established sites using scientific benchmarks and a lot of ongoing work at IBAs already. So it was kind of a natural foundation for the identification of many KBAs at once in Canada. We've also already done some work on biodiversity that exists in IBAs a few years ago. So we already knew that most of these IBAs hold more biodiversity than just birds and are important for the biodiversity that is there as well. So first I'll say we were one of the first countries to do this work to try to identify which IBAs will become KBAs. So there wasn't really a process outlined that we could follow. So basically we relied on Dean's smarts. He's our data guru. He's in the picture there to guide us along this process. First, we harvested bird data, and it was about 17 million records. And then we updated all population estimates using BirdLife International, Partners in Flight, and COSEWIC data. And I'll say, sorry, I'll back up. The 17 million records, that comes from Nature Counts, our data storehouse, basically, that Birds Canada manages. And what feeds into there is eBird, all of our programs across Canada, all the Birds Canada programs, including marsh monitoring, bird atlases, Great Backyard Bird Count, anything that's Birds Canada program gets fed into there. So a lot of data is already there. So then we use the population estimates and the data that we have to test it against the KBA criteria, both global and national. And Kira showed that we had a national standard, and we use that in assessing the national populations of things. So for this crosswalk, we used just two criteria: species at risk and big concentrations of birds, which is similar to what we had used for IBA assessments in the past. So it's criteria A1 for threatened species and D1 for aggregations, if anyone's interested. So here are some of the results. out of 17 million observations, 50,000 records met KBA thresholds in our 582 IBAs across Canada. And so provisional KBAs, there are global KBAs, 277, and 172 national KBAs. And actually 133 IBAs do not currently meet any KBA criteria at all across the country. So this is just an overview of what the numbers that I just gave you, but with the polygons. So you can see the red ones are, I'll zoom in later, but the red ones are global KBAs, and the gray ones have no data, and can't really see any of the yellow ones in this one, but we will here. So this is zoomed into Ontario, and some of the Ontario numbers are, well, there's 65 IBAs to begin with in Ontario. 38 of those are presumptive global KBAs, and 19 national, and then 8 of them have no qualifying KBA triggers at all. So of the presumptive global and national KBAs, 28 have data deficiencies. So these are either species that have only 1 year of data or a single observation, or have data that's only older than 12 years. So we're looking to update, get the most up-to-date data before we nominate these as KBAs. So here's just a kind of a zoom in of the Northern Ontario sites around the southwestern parts of the James and Hudson's Bay. And as you can see, the red are global, the yellow ones are national, and the 1 gray or 2 gray ones they have no data whatsoever that triggers a KBA. And then the blue outline there for a lot of those means they're data deficient. So unfortunately, like I said, we don't have the most up-to-date data at those sites. And then this is just a zoom in of southwestern Ontario. So same thing. There are quite a few sites that are data deficient. And there's also 2 sites I couldn't really fit on the map. They're kind of near the Manitoba border, near Kenora, and they're also data deficient as well. So a challenge we're working on, obviously, is how to deal with these sites that only have old or one-off vagrant data. And a lot of those are at remote sites that can't be surveyed regularly. So also we're still, I know someone's going to ask this, it's like the $1 million question. We're still working out how to handle sites that don't qualify for KBA status at all, especially when there's conservation work at them. They'll just, yeah, we're still kind of working out how to do that, but not to worry, the IBAs aren't just going to disappear when we turn over to KBAs. There'll be a slow process, and that's why we're kind of working and filling those data gaps in. So right now we have opened this up to a provincial review. We've distributed those initial results along with the map, up-to-date bird data, and a Google form where we ask questions that address whether or not our crosswalk is complete. And we're asking local experts and national coordinators across Canada to fill those out. And this is, yeah, especially important for those data deficient sites that I showed you on the map. And I know that a lot of you on this call probably have bird expertise across the province and with specific sites. So it would be great to get your input on this if we could, and for you to be involved in the program right from the start, giving us your local knowledge, I guess, in these sites. So in the survey that Robin sent out, there is a question about IBAs. So if you're interested, if you saw, you know, a blue lit up IBA that you think, oh, I have data for that, or you think you can contribute another way, yeah, answer that survey, and then I'll get your name from Robin. Yeah, I think that, oh, what did I put here? Oh, yes, and we're also working on, with WCS and NatureServe, assessing KBAs, new KBAs and existing IBA overlaps. So we're finding that kind of every new case is different. So it's kind of an interesting thing to assess that and how the boundaries will change. And also, we just got some kind of preliminary data from NatureServe on adding other taxa to existing IBAs. So that's really exciting to kind of start figuring out what other species will be added to these IBAs in the future. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me talk. I hope you could see my slides. I will stop sharing now. There we go.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was great. We're really looking forward to working with Birds Canada on this program and developing the different KBAs within the province. I am going to now talk to you about the Ontario KBA program. Is everyone able to see my screen?
I am.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. And if anyone does have problems with it, I will also share my PowerPoint afterwards, but hopefully it works smoothly. So my name is Robin Rumney, and I'm the Ontario KBA Regional Coordinator with WCS Canada. And I'm going to just give you a quick overview today of the Ontario Key Biodiversity Area program. So we have two broad objectives for the Ontario program. The first of which is to identify all potential KBA sites in Ontario using sound, unbiased methodology. And the second objective is to increase knowledge and understanding of KBAs within Ontario. So it's quite a new program still, so a lot of people don't know what KBAs are. So I appreciate everyone being here today, and everyone's attendance and future collaboration can help us achieve both of these goals. So our work plan in Ontario is based on both the global and the national standards for the identification of key biodiversity areas. So we're using both of these standards to identify both global and national KBAs. The first part of our plan is to identify biodiversity elements that might trigger KBAs. We then find candidate sites that hold these biodiversity elements in high enough thresholds or high enough populations to potentially trigger KBA thresholds, which we evaluate against the KBA criteria. And then if they do meet the thresholds, we delineate the boundaries of each KBA with the help of experts and other knowledge holders to make sure our boundaries are appropriate. We then prepare the KBA proposals and invite reviews of the KBAs, both at a technical and general scale, to make sure that our information is accurate and everyone that wants to have a say has a chance to do so. Once this is done, we submit the KBA proposals for national KBAs to the Canadian Secretariat, and for global KBAs, it goes from the Canadian Secretariat to the Global Secretariat. So the timeline for this work is approximately 1 year is our goal, and it started in April of this year. So for the first 6 months, we're working on research-based activities of finding different biodiversity elements and candidate sites that hold these, and then starting to evaluate them against the KBA criteria. The second half of our project year will be designated for delineating KBAs and hosting delineation workshops, and then preparing the proposals and going through the KBA review process. Our goal is by the end or by the beginning of April in 2022 to have many of Ontario's KBAs officially designated. So there are 5 broad KBA criteria that we work with, and these are the same ones that are used around the globe and across the country. So they are for KBAs can be designated for areas that have threatened biodiversity, geographically restricted biodiversity, have high ecological integrity, have important biological processes that occur within them, and areas that are irreplaceable as deemed through specific quantitative analysis. So in Ontario, we're going to be focusing on the 3 that are bolded: the threatened biodiversity, geographically restricted biodiversity, and biological processes. This is because the methods are well developed within Canada, and we suspect that we have quite a few sites that'll fall under these within Ontario. Once we're done these, then we'll move on and start to make sure we're not missing any other KBAs in other categories. So to give you an idea of how some of these criteria work, I'll use A1 or threatened species as an example. So A1 can trigger KBAs for global species that are listed on the IUCN Red List as being vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered or even possibly extinct in the wild. It can also be triggered national KBAs for species that are listed either by COSEWIC and or in NatureServe Canada. And for COSEWIC, these would be threatened and endangered species. And for NatureServe Canada, these would be species that are nationally ranked as being either N1 or N2, so quite at risk. These KBA sites have to hold a certain percentage of either the global or the national population, depending on whether it's a global or national KBA. And we use stringent criteria and thresholds to see if these sites have enough of the population to trigger a KBA. So just because a site does have a species at risk on it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a KBA, and we have to do these threshold tests first to decide. So another type of KBA is B1, which is individually geographically restricted species. So KBAs for B1 are triggered when a site holds a significant portion of a global or a national population, but in this case, they don't have to be species at risk, but the sites do have to hold quite a large proportion of the population. So in this case, it's 10% of the population has to be on these geographically restricted sites. And for these species, it's usually the entire life cycle that occurs within these sites. So if we were to have these sites removed from the system, these species would be at risk, even though they're not currently listed as species at risk. So it could be something like an area in Southern Ontario, a small area that houses salamanders, where the salamanders can't live anywhere but that unrestricted ecosystem. For both A and B criteria, we have 6 different assessment parameters we can use. So I mentioned that the sites have to hold a certain amount of the population, but in some cases we don't know the population on a site or at a global or a national scale. And this could be due to just the difficulty of sampling that particular species or a species that is in a very remote area that we can't sample. And in these cases, we can use our different assessment parameters, such as area of occupancy, extent of suitable habitat, range, number of localities, and distinct genetic diversity. So we start at the top of that list and use those first, but if we can't find them, we work our way down the list. This is really important because it allows us to trigger KBAs, even for these species that we might not have super accurate, or not accurate, but we don't know, we don't have those population level surveys, but we might have very detailed area of occupancy or extent of suitable habitat information. So another type of KBA that could be triggered would be D1, which is for demographic aggregations. These are for aggregations of a species over a season and during one or more key stages of its life cycle. So again, these trigger species do not have to be species at risk, but these sites hold a large enough amount of the population during these key life stages that if we were to get rid of these sites, the species would again potentially be at risk for continuation. So an example of a D1 KBA could be an area with bat hibernaculum. So in the spring and summer, they live more dispersed, but in the winter, they come together and aggregate during this key pregnancy life stage. And another example could be salamanders that come into a single pool to breed in the spring. So I also mentioned that we do have some other KBA criteria that we're not going to focus on. So we have ecosystem criteria, which are threatened ecosystem types, geographically restricted ecosystem types, and ecological integrity. So while this won't be my focus, WCS Canada has just very recently hired a new KBA coordinator to focus on these ecosystem criteria KBAs. So Lucy Poley has joined our team, and she's going to be looking at these across the country and as well as in Ontario. So we're hopeful that she'll be able to designate some Ontario KBAs under these criteria as well. If you're interested in learning more about the KBA process and all of its details, we have a really great new YouTube video on our WCS Canada YouTube channel that goes over the different KBA criteria and how to calculate the thresholds in just about 10 minutes. So that's worth checking out if you want to learn more. And if you want even more details, you can see the global and national KBA standards on the KBA website. And I believe Kira already linked those in the chat. So those go into everything in more detail. So usually when KBAs are designated, it's the Canadian Secretariat that does it through expert meetings and brainstorming and collaboration. But it is also possible that any individuals or groups can submit a nomination for a KBA to the Secretariat. So if you do want to learn more, check out these sources and also reach out to us because we can help work you through the process and we can collaborate on this together. So there will be other opportunities for input throughout this Ontario KBA program. So during the current research phase that we're in now, we're seeking ideas for potential KBAs and tips on different experts who could help us with species and site data. So that's super useful to our process. And in the KBA preparation phase, we're always seeking advice on which stakeholders and rights holders we should contact to make sure that everyone has been notified and has the opportunity to collaborate. We'll also be hosting delineation workshops for our different knowledge holders and working together to delineate appropriate boundaries for each KBA. And in the review phase, we seek technical review input from different knowledge holders to make sure our KBAs are unbiased and correct and everything has been done according to the book. And then we also seek feedback from stakeholders and rights holders, just again to make sure everyone's aware of what we're doing before the KBA is finalized. And KBA final data will be publicly accessible. Right now, we have placeholders that are available on the KBA Canada public dashboard. So right now it's just a center point for each KBA and some taxa information on what triggered it. Eventually, as Amanda mentioned, this will be transferred to a public registry that will be co-managed by Birds Canada and WCS Canada. And all of our KBAs will also be available on the KBA Canada website. And for global KBAs will be available on the global KBA website. It's really important to note that we have a strong partnership with the Natural Heritage Information Centre, the NHIC. So we work with them to make sure we don't share any inappropriate data for sensitive species. And we will problem solve on a case-by-case basis to determine what information should and should not be shared for each trigger species that's of a sensitive nature, to make sure that everything is by the books and that we're not sharing any information we shouldn't be, but we're still keeping this as an open process for everyone to be aware of. As been mentioned, we do have a participation survey that we're asking everyone to fill out, and I'll thank a few people have already done it, so that's great. This will facilitate participation and collaboration in the progress. I'm planning on sending updates by email to those who are interested to let them know what progress we've made and what KBAs we're working on. As well, there's information here to review some of the IBAs that Amanda mentioned. And the survey should only take 5 minutes. And I'll just also mention, if you filled it out before the meeting, but you have some new ideas now, feel free to resubmit and I'll look at your most recent submission for that. I'll also mention that we're planning a KBA expert training meeting later this month. So this will be an hour-and-a-half session that will go into much more detail on the KBA thresholds and delineation. So it'll get right down to those numbers and all the different criteria and sub-criteria. So because it'll be quite technical, this will be geared for knowledge holders who will be helping consult on KBA species and sites. But saying that, everyone is welcome. So if you're interested in learning more, indicate on the survey or email me, and I will send you information on this. And please share with anyone who you think might be interested or who has knowledge that would be valuable to this process. Thank you so much to all of our collaborators and our different funders. We've had some really great collaboration, even just this early into the project, so I'm very thankful for that. And I'm looking forward to working with many more of you over the coming year as we identify, hopefully, many KBAs within the province. Thank you. Okay, so our final speaker on our agenda today is Mike Oldham. Mike Oldham is an Emeritus Research Associate with the Natural Heritage Information Centre, or the NHIC in Ontario. Mike was a provincial botanist with the NHIC from its inception in 1993 until this March when he retired. And we're very thankful to have Mike closely involved in this process and already doing some expert consulting for us so far.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear, and I can see you too.
Okay, great. Yeah, as Robin mentioned, I recently retired from the NHIC and was involved with the KBA process when I was at NHIC, attending meetings in Ottawa in March 2018, and then again another workshop in Montreal in February 2020. And I think the information that NHIC and other conservation data centers manage is really excellent for applying towards the KBA criteria. So what I've been doing so far in my involvement is going over a list of almost 1,000 species that was generated by NatureServe Canada of potential Ontario KBA trigger species, and just taking a look at whether we have enough information on locations where they occur, population sizes, and other information so that we can apply the KBA criteria. The species in the candidate list were based on information such as status on IUCN Red List, whether it's a COSEWIC listed species, what its global and national NatureServe conservation status ranks are. So NatureServe Canada queried this list of species, and I'm trying to come up with a shorter list of things that are most likely to be able to satisfy KBA criteria. I've also been helping a bit with suggesting potential experts that can be used to get better information on some of the less well-known species. There's lots of invertebrates and non-vascular plants and lichens and things that are known to be globally or nationally rare, but in many cases we may not have information on population sizes, or we may not even know the ranges well enough to be able to apply KBA criteria. So what I've been doing so far is trying to provide some input and whittle down this list of almost 1,000 species to a smaller number that we can really focus on and try and apply as KBA triggers to identify some of these sites that are important for conservation. I think I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm happy to address any questions when we get into the question period about what I've been doing to assist the process.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's been really great to have you involved so far. So thank you for sharing your perspective on this. So that's the end of our scheduled speakers. So now we're going to open things up for questions. So we have about just over 10 minutes until 1 o'clock, and then past 1 o'clock, people are welcome to stay if they want to discuss things with us. But for now, we're going to start by answering some of the questions in the chat. Now, Kira, it looks like you've already answered a few of them. Did you see any that?
I was going to say, just maybe we can go over some of the ones in the chat, just because there have been some very good and interesting questions and some clarifying questions as well. So I'm not sure how far to go back up, probably after all the questions about my terrible inability to move the slides, but which I apologize again for. That's always not a great way to start an event, but yeah, so if you would like to go through some of them and sort of recap as we wait for more questions.
Sure. So I guess the first question I see is from Greg Main. There seems to be a big focus on birds. Would you clarify if the focus is on birds or all species? Also, do you distinguish between aquatic and terrestrial systems? I guess I will say something there. Kira's already gave an answer, and then Amanda might want to say something as well. But historically we were looking, well, the focus was on important bird and biodiversity areas, which did have a focus on birds, but the KBA process treats all different taxa equally. So the focus will no longer be just on birds, but there will be likely a lot of bird KBAs just because these are the sites that were previously IBAs who have the information, but the map of what taxa triggers KBAs should equal out as we move through this process. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think that question was asked before your presentation, so you probably answered it in your presentation as well.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, and Greg Main also asked, are you aware of Great Lakes biodiversity conservation strategies, and will this information be considered? Kira, do you have a response for that?
Just to say that we should consider all information as it's relevant. And so for sure, we were really interested in information sources that can help us identify interesting sites. Even after that, once we've identified some of the KBAs, it'll be important to figure out, well, what are the ongoing efforts already there, and make sure that, you know, we're talking to the people who are already engaged in different kinds of processes and projects on the ground so that we get the best information possible about the site and the species. Great,
thank you. Okay, Randy Moyes asked, how big is a geographically restricted site? And Kira has answered in the chat. Geographically restricted is defined simply as at least 10% of the population of the species can be found in a single site. The sites could be far apart as long as that threshold is met. Generally, we've been finding sites like this in areas of high endemism, where species are restricted to a small part of Canada, for example, Yukon, Beringia, Sable Island, and others. So thank you for that, Kira. Okay, and then we have another question here from Greg, looking to see if we are working with the NHIC. I think we answered this question during my presentation. Yes, we are working closely with the NHIC. They're one of our key partners on this. Okay, and then we have a question from Josh asking, for categories like D1 or imperiled ecosystems, is the focus national or global or both? And I would say the focus is both, where it depends on what species we're looking at within that, whether or not they're imperiled at a national or a global scale. Do you have anything to add, Kira?
Just to say that the species criteria are the simplest to apply because all the methods and understanding is there already. But ecosystems has been very difficult to apply, and we have actually a couple of partners in Ontario who've been looking into, for example, Great Lakes Alvar, and trying to figure out what the national extent of that ecosystem is, what the global extent of that ecosystem is. And that's definitely an ecosystem that would qualify, but because Canada doesn't have a completed national vegetation classification, and we have lots of classification systems that differ across provinces and territories, one of our first steps is try to figure out how those ecosystems, whether the ecosystems even qualify in the right category, because we have to assess them at the right ecosystem level. And so we need to crosswalk between the global and the national and sort of provincial systems. So just to say that this is work that we are in the midst of developing the methodology for, and we've just brought on an ecosystem criteria coordinator, Lucy Poley, who will be leading some of this work, which it'll require a little bit of thinking first, but we hope to identify some of those sites in Ontario.
Great. We have a question from Jordan Becker. Is the long-term intention to do away with IBAs once the crosswalk is done and the KBA network has been established?
I will take that one. I guess I would say two things. I would say it's going to be a slow transition and we're not 100% sure how it's going to look. And the second thing I would say is that we're not doing away with it. We're adding like really valuable information to these sites that already exist and kind of reassessing them with new species. So I don't think they're ever going to disappear, like they're there, but they will be called KBAs eventually. So, and a whole bunch of information will be added to them, which will be valuable.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. We have another question from Jordan. Based on the criteria identified, the process to identify KBAs is very data-driven. This creates a bias for species that are more commonly monitored, such as birds, and areas that are studied more, excluding remote, especially northern areas. Is the KBA group taking steps to mitigate these challenges? I don't imagine some species guilds have much data representation, such as fungi and arthropods.
Mike, do you want to take that? I can add to it after.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and that's one of the things I've been trying to do in whittling down this list of almost 1,000 potential KBA triggers. And if it's a species we really don't know much about, then obviously we can't say whether 90% or 50% or any percent of the global population occurs in a site. And it's just that some taxonomic groups are better studied than others, and the KBA criteria have numerical thresholds and quantitative data are required, and you know, I guess it is what it is in terms of applying the criteria, and some species just don't have enough information to say with any confidence that, yeah, 90% of the global population is at site X if we really don't know the full extent of the range of the species. So, you know, I think with consulting with experts and digging a little deeper into the data that's out there, there's certainly lots of invertebrates and non-vascular plants and other taxa that can be used, but there's also going to be quite a few, especially in poorly known taxonomic groups, that we just don't have the data to be able to apply the criteria.
Yeah, so I would add to that one of the things we hope to do is, because we have a long list of KBA trigger species, is what we call them, species that could trigger a KBA, but many that are data deficient, we do hope to provide a service that, you know, to draw attention to those species and the need for additional survey work for those that we could identify a KBA for these species, and they're very important for us to look at, but we don't have that information available to us. So that the quantitative thresholds and the need for very high level of evidence has strengths and weaknesses. It means that anyone can do this work, and if it's a place is identified as a KBA, it absolutely is, and you can have great faith in that because of all the evidence needed. But the flip side is that many places we won't be able to identify them as KBAs, but we hope to be able to contribute to making sure that could happen in the future.
Great, thank you, Mike and Kara, for that. Okay, the next question from Karen Hartley is, what is your approach for identifying sites that meet criteria for biological processes? Kara, do you want to take that one?
Sure, so that's under the D criteria, which really there's no need to identify sort of the actual processes or provide information about those processes. What we're trying to do is capture sites that are important during particular processes in a species life cycle. So, for example, fish spawning grounds or caribou calving sites. So it's really just trying to identify these sites that are key to some part of the life cycle of a species, where they aggregate in huge numbers in a predictable way. So not just once, but they have to, there's all sorts of rules about, you know, it has to be 3 years out of the last, I can't remember how many that were surveyed. So that is trying to just identify these sites that are particularly important during the life cycle of a species, where if that site were to be impacted, it would negatively impact those life cycle stages. So I think if there's any other further questions about that, we can elaborate, but that's generally the idea behind those criteria.
Great, thank you. So we have a question regarding ecosystems. Can KBAs be disjunct, or do they have to be connected? For example, alver habitats scattered but not necessarily adjacent.
That's a great question, and it's one that we have had many discussions about. But generally, a site doesn't have to, and an ecosystem. This is also why the ecosystem criteria are a little trickier than the species criteria. It's not expected that a site would have only suitable habitat for a species, or that would contain only the ecosystem in question. We're looking at places like in the prairies, where almost all of the grassland ecosystems are threatened and could trigger a key biodiversity area, but their level of impactedness and quality and sort of conversion are very varied even within sites. So it's something where we need to listen to experts who know those ecosystems really well. And generally, when you delineate a site, you're trying to include as much of the biodiversity element in question as you can, and try to have as little of other landscape elements as you possibly can, but some degree of inclusion of those are expected.
Great. Okay. Catherine Yagi said, just wanted to chime in about the data-driven criteria for KBAs. We just had a meeting with the COSEWIC subcommittee I'm a member of, and there is a bit of a push for data-deficient species to have a higher priority for assessment, not top priority, but higher than those with no change in status. So thank you, Catherine. That's great to note here, and hopefully that will help push for KBAs for these lesser studied groups. Okay, a question about Indigenous knowledge. So what is the process for gathering and incorporating Indigenous knowledge? So that's a great question. I'll start, and then maybe Kara wants to add to what I've said, but we are trying to work with all of the Indigenous partners in each of the sites that we're working with KBAs on. So we hope to involve the Indigenous communities and invite their knowledge, so and treat their data input as just as important as the COSEWIC data and things like that. So we're trying to make sure that they're involved, and they and we do have some groups that are keen to have some of the sites on their land assessed for KBA, so they have been involved, and we're encouraging everyone to reach out if they know of someone who wants to get involved, and we're going to do our best to try to incorporate all the Indigenous knowledge and involve the Indigenous communities at each stage. Okay, and we have a question about the expected impact of the KBA designations. That's a really great question from Lisa. Kira, do you have an answer for that?
Sure, and this is a work in progress too. So the work that we're doing right now is very much focused on the science side of things, the identification and delineation of these sites, but with the idea that at one point groups will make use of this information to encourage appropriate stewardship of these sites to ensure that the biodiversity is able to thrive in these sites. And I think that can be done in all sorts of different ways. So, and one of the reasons that we try to reach out to broad communities as we're doing this work is so that everyone is aware of them and can make use of this information in the way that they see fit. And every group will have a different idea of what's appropriate. As I mentioned, there's no prescribed management for any of these sites. But for example, Nature Conservancy of Canada is interested in making use of this information to inform its purchasing prioritization, whereas other groups may be more interested in saying, well, these are where all the KBAs are. Here's a few where protected area status might be possible and appropriate. In other places, there might be. So we've in British Columbia, we've been approached by a group developing a proposal for an Indigenous protected and conserved area, and they wanted to know if there might be KBAs in that area that would strengthen their proposal to the federal government. So these are all different ways, and there's myriad other ways too that this could have an impact, but it is information that is being asked for by governments at different scales, by almost all of the big NGOs across Canada, because of the robust, consistent nature of it based on an international standard. And they see it as information that you can trust. It doesn't really matter who's involved again, but the fact that we're trying to involve everybody so that people can understand that is our approach. And I think that leads to potential for it being more widely used once all these sites are identified.
Great, thank you, Kara.
Sorry, can I just say that in the past IBAs, it's been really site specific too for the actions that have to go on. You know, some could benefit from further protection, some could benefit from invasive species removal. So I think it really depends on the site as well.
Great, thank you. I just want to also note that we're just past 1 o'clock now, so for anyone that has to leave the meeting, feel free, but we're going to stick around just to keep answering questions until 1:30, because I know there's a lot of people on the call, and this is a new concept, so we probably have a lot of different questions coming in. But thank you everyone who does have to leave. Thank you so much for attending. We look forward to collaborating with everyone who's interested. Okay, we have a question from David. Are you aware of the ECCC's CNPP sites? They will likely be a good contact for Indigenous knowledge.
Can we unpack that acronym, CNPP? Does anyone know what that stands for?
I'm going to...
Is it the priority places?
I just allowed everyone to unmic. So if anyone
community nominated priority places. Thank you so much. We are aware of these, and both sets of priority places, in fact, the government designated ones and the community nominated ones. And in places where we've begun work already, for example, in Yukon and Atlantic Canada, we have had interactions with the priority place groups to see whether our priorities could align, whether, you know, that sometimes there's funding available to do work that meets the objectives of both groups, and certainly there's a lot of overlap because these areas were chosen for a reason. They're great. They have great biodiversity values, often great biocultural values. So I think that absolutely, and we'll have to see in Ontario. I'm not sure if we've looked into that yet, but that's certainly on Robin's list.
Yeah, it is. Thank you, Kara. Okay. Kate Potter said that biosphere regions in Ontario are interested in the gathering of Indigenous knowledge discussion with the Indigenous hosts of the biosphere regions. So that's really great to hear, Kate. And if anyone has any additional suggestions on how we can better involve Indigenous communities, please reach out to me, because we're trying to do our best in that way, but we're always open to suggestions. Okay, and Jordan Becker asks, are you able to share GIS data for candidate KBAs that are currently under consideration? And Jordan is with ECCC. I'm not sure if you have an answer for that, Kira.
So in Ontario, we're just beginning, of course. So the important bird and biodiversity areas, those boundaries are freely available on the Birds Canada website. For other Ontario sites, we're just starting off. So this is where Robin's work is cut out for her. And certainly she'll be looking for input for everybody. Generally, we don't share the boundaries of KBAs before they've been through a very long process of review. So they're peer reviewed by any knowledge holders that have particular information about species and ecosystems and the sites, and then it's opened up for a more general review to rights holders, stakeholders who may not be an expert in a particular group of species that trigger the KBA, but are experts in you know, the conservation context and the needs of people and what the sites should be in the surrounding landscape. So we can talk anyway if there's sort of an interest in collaborating on those particular sites, but generally we wouldn't be sending the shapefiles before they have been accepted. And we've checked with all the conservation data centers, for example, in this case the NHIC, to make sure that there's no sensitivity there and the information is okay for sharing. But all of it will be freely available once it's gone through those processes.
And if you're interested to see the ones that we've assessed, I'll put my email in the chat and I can send you that map.
Great, thank you, Amanda and Kira. Doug Tate has a question. I thought one slide noted KBA was not another single species driven process or similar comment, yet there was a lot of talk about trigger species. Just to clarify, that means it can be based on single species, but there are many other options. Single species is not the primary criteria, are different criteria weighted differently. So I'm not sure which slide Doug's referring to. It was that one in yours, Kara, but I can give a general answer. That KBAs can be triggered from single species, but it's not. I wonder if what you're meaning is, if what the slide was referring to is that it's not just a single type of species, it's all species being treated equally. So KBA could be triggered for a spider or a mussel. And in many cases, KBAs do have multiple triggers within them. So we assess all potential triggers within a site. But in some cases, we do have KBAs for one single species, whatever that species is, because that site is disproportionately important to that species conservation. But in many cases, there will be more than one trigger. But we're not weighing one taxon above any other. They're all being treated equally. So I hopefully that answers that question.
I can just add a little bit to that because I think it's a very good comment. It does sound like we go species by species, and in part that's a little bit because of the nature of biodiversity in Canada. Ontario is a little bit different, so is southern BC, where in the Carolinian sort of landscape you're going to have sites like Long Point, for example, that are going to be triggered by a huge range of species from multiple taxonomic groups under different criteria as well. But that's not necessarily true of all of Canada, where we don't have huge densities of species at risk in particular sites. They're really spread out. We just have a huge country, and that's very different in other parts of the world. So this is based on a global standard that was developed and tested across the world, but we're finding is sometimes very appropriate for Canada, and sometimes, well, some of those criteria don't really meet, like end up with many sites in Canada, for example. Well, there's some sub-criteria that I won't get into with geographically restricted assemblages of species within a certain taxonomic order. If you go to a forest in the Congo, you'll find many sites like that that are being triggered by dozens of species and ecosystems. And in Canada, while we have some sites in the south like that, many of our sites, in fact, are triggered by one or two species, or sometimes a number of species and an ecosystem. But it ends up, the only idea that it's not a single species approach is that it's not focused on birds or on like a species at risk SARA plan where it's just focused on one species, that it's a tool to identify sites that are important for all taxonomic groups and ecosystems.
Great, thank you. Jonathan Coquette just linked in the KBA map in progress from the KBA Canada webpage and asked what are the status of these. So those are the KBAs that are currently being worked on, but many of them aren't finalized. So those are the sites that we're currently looking at, and that list will grow, especially for places like Ontario, where we're just starting the initiative. But when the sites are finalized, they will be, like I said, they'll be available. So you'll know when they're finalized, and we have those final information data sets for them.
And that map does not include IBAs that have been assessed for KBAs yet.
Thank you, Amanda. Yes, that's right. Okay, I think that's all of the questions in the chat. Oh, and Jonathan asked, are those being proposed by KBA or other groups? So all of the ones in the Canada KBA in Progress website are being, I'm not sure if some of them might have been started by other groups, but they're all being dealt with by the Secretariat, and this KBA Secretariat, and that's why they're in the website. So all KBAs end up in the same place, regardless of who does the initial work for them. They're all going to end up in the Secretariat database on the website.
At the moment, it's only WCS Canada that is developing new sites. But for example, in the Ojibwe Tallgrass Prairie, we are interested in partners who can, who, if they're interested in identifying a site themselves, we can provide support, training, GIS, anything like that. Although we're coordinating most of it, it's mostly because there's this push to try to get it done. But we do foresee a time once we've identified most sites in Canada, that it will then mostly be external groups who want to test their own sites, and we will provide the tools and resources to be able to do that.
Yes, that's great. Thanks, Kira. And Jonathan just added that Wildlife Preservation Canada is working on the nomination for Ojibwe Prairie Complex. So thank you, Wildlife Preservation Canada and Jonathan. It's great that you're doing that work there, and we're excited to work together to see what the final KBA looks like. Catherine Yagi, I noticed Wainfleet Bog isn't on there yet. Is it still in the process of being considered? Catherine, yes, it is. I was given all of your data and all of your reports, so I really appreciate you sending those to me. I'm just still in the process of looking at it at the province at a larger scale. And then my next step will start to be assessing these individual sites and looking for sites for each trigger. So Wainfleet Bog is definitely on my list of sites that I will be assessing, but it won't make the map until it's a bit further along in the process.
There's one question above from Randy.
Oh, thank you. I note from the IBA maps that the boreal forest is rather poorly represented, at least by birds. Would intact ecosystems be the way that the boreal might be assessed?
Absolutely. And this is very exciting because we're just starting to be able to, we've finished the methodology development for criterion C, which is large sites of the highest ecological integrity, and we're only allowed to identify 2 per ecoregion. There won't be, because they're supposed to be about 10,000 kilometers plus in size. This is where we stretch the definition of site for that one criterion. But they'll be identified more in the boreal and further north based on where are the areas with the lowest human footprint and the highest biotic integrity. So we have a team of researchers across Canada, including a lot of boreal scientists who have been looking at all data sets to try to figure out sort of the human footprint side of things and biotic integrity. And criterion C sites will be identified in Northern Ontario and the boreal ecosystem more generally.
Great, thank you, Kira. Okay, I think that's all of the questions we have in the chat. I'll now give anyone an opportunity. If you want to raise your hand, I think you should be able to unmute yourself now, but just raise your hand so we make sure everyone goes in a neat order. But if anyone has any questions or discussions or comments, you can say them now or keep putting them in the chat as well.
Or suggestions for great sites and species to follow up on. We're getting a lot of fantastic information from Mike. It'll be really interesting to see if there's other suggestions.
Okay, Jordan Becker, you can go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourself. Perfect.
Hi all. Thanks so much for the presentation. That was great. And this is my last question, I promise. I know I've asked a few already in the chat. I had heard earlier, and I was just walking back upstairs because I had to step away, that you've got some kind of connection to the Pathway to Target 1 group. And I'm just wondering, I'm not sure if you said this, but how this process will inform the pathway process, knowing that quite often the I guess conservation and land securement is so often focused on acres as opposed to biodiversity. So how this, if there's already a plan to incorporate, you know, the idea of KBAs into that process.
Thanks for that question. So right from the beginning, the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process has had a number of working groups feeding into it, not just to get the acres, but to get what they call the quality elements of those acres. I'm not sure why we're using acres. So the idea is that, yes, we're supposed to meet that 17% protected area target by last year, but it shouldn't just be any land. It should be land that's important for biodiversity. And so there was a connectivity working group looking at, well, where will the land be that contributes most to connectivity? There was trying to remember, representativity working group. There was an IPCA working group to see how this could overlap with Indigenous priorities for conservation and land management. And then there was a key biodiversity area working group. And we're the only working group that isn't actually a government-led working group. We're fully led outside of government by NGOs, and particularly the 3 organizations that I mentioned before. And so there is a plan. So it's one of the things that we want to be careful of, though, is not to put all the emphasis on protected area, informing protected area planning, because we do think that that is a fantastic tool, but it's one of many and may not be appropriate in some places. But there is already a plan to incorporate key biodiversity areas within federal level protected area planning, at least for federal sort of land acquisition for that purpose. And we're sort of constantly giving feedback to the federal government for that, to the pathway process in particular. When it comes to provincial and territorial levels, that's sort of province by province and territory by territory, where there may be other ways to feed into more like species at risk policy development or land use management of different types. So it's all a work in progress, those kinds of conversations.
Great, thank you, Kira. Are there any other questions? Again, feel free. I've allowed everyone to unmute and turn on your video if you prefer as well now. Okay, I think that might be it. If anyone has a last minute question, just go ahead. Otherwise, I will thank everyone for coming out today. And just please fill out the survey if you get the chance, and email me if you have any suggestions of sites. Thank you, Kara, linked it in the chat. If you have any suggestions of sites that I should be looking at within Ontario, or species that you think might trigger a KBA, or if you'd like to become involved, please reach out at any time. We're hoping to really make this a very collaborative process. So it's been really great having everyone here today. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.